Just got back from a little garage sale that I happened to come across, and I bought a bunch of stuff for cheap on instinct. I got a bunch of Dr. Seuss books that I looked up, priced them, and they're a little bit overhyped. I don't know. And I got 3 clothing items, just stuff that's going to sell for 15 to 20 bucks. This is an apropos time to talk about my business model. I got into a big extended war of words with someone in the comments section of my last video. I want to put my business model in context of why I settled on it and why it makes sense for me and why it may or may not make sense for you. So I live in California, I live in San Diego, and I've been a reseller in California for like 4 years, for the entire duration of my tenure as a reseller. And California thrift stores are legendarily gouge priced. Average cost of a shirt is anywhere between 6 to 15 bucks. It's, you know, just out of control a lot of times. And a lot of the thrift stores, especially Goodwill, are pretty savvy, are savvier than you would think. They catch the good stuff. They know what Patagonia is. They know even some of the nicer, formal wear brands, and they know to price it up. And I don't have a bins here in San Diego. There was one up in LA where I lived, but there's not a real bins here, a pay by the pound bins. There's kind of a pseudo bins where it's just priced per item and it's a little bit cheaper. But I do have swap meets / flea markets, and can find some cheap stuff there. But for the most part, the cost of goods is pretty high. And I'm a solo operator. I don't have employees. I live in a relatively small place, and I could pack it full of 3,000 clothing items if I really wanted to, but I don't really want to. So I settled on kind of the quick flip model of clothing reselling to expedite the process of getting money in short order and reducing the footprint of my clothing inventory and being able to make fast turnarounds, kind of turn and burn sales on clothing that is overpriced at Goodwills. The necessity there, or the utility of the sell-through rate metric, is I can identify stuff that even if it is overpriced, it's worth the risk of buying it if I know that I can sell it within 90 days and make 50, 100% to 300% ROI. So that's kind of the orientation that I've had as a reseller since then. The origins of this business model really lie in a channel called Golden Finger Picker, which is a husband and wife team who do what's called the quick flip. So what they do is they buy hard goods, they buy appliances and military stuff and antiques, and they price it under market. So they make a great listing for something that is in demand, and they undercut the market by some margin of like 15-20%. So for example, if he sold a combo VCR DVD player that has a bottom of the market around 150 bucks. Those are the cheapest offerings. He'll come in and list it for 125, 130, maybe even lower. Have everything necessary that the buyer wants. He'll print out a manual for it. He'll buy a remote. He'll bundle it all up together, take beautiful photos, and do everything possible to make sure that the timeline for that flip is as short as possible. So he'll flip stuff in 24, 48 hours, take the profits and use it to buy more inventory, and makes an extraordinary amount of money. Wonderful channel, one of my favorite channels. Chad and Kim have probably made me more money than anybody on this planet once I started adopting not necessarily that direct business model, but that mentality. I do that. I do that particular maneuver with certain stuff like suits or nicer, more expensive pieces that do have an established market. If it's a boutique brand, if it's something like Gucci, and I have an authentic Gucci t-shirt, let's say, and the cheapest one available is 50 bucks, I will sell it for $35 just to stand out. Make sure that I don't have to promote my listings to get eyeballs on it, and expedite the sale that way. So I do quick flipping with clothing. I also do this kind of mutated version of quick flipping, which is paying really close attention to sell-through, finding stuff that's in really, really high demand, and also pricing the stuff close to the bottom of the market to make sure that the turnaround period is pretty short. I consider that also a form of quick flipping. I guess opinions vary. So this is not the only business model. This is one of many business models. I don't know of anybody else that really does clothing reselling specifically in the way that I do it. There's a couple of people that track those metrics really closely as well. But I want to go over the alternatives because it's important to know what you're signing up for if you follow my advice versus somebody else's advice. The closest business model to mine in terms of subjectively what it's like is the high ASP model. ASP is an acronym that stands for average sales price or average selling price. The philosophy here is focus only on stuff that is exceptionally valuable. So you go out and look for stuff like cashmere suits or Brioni pants or stuff like that when it comes to clothing. You know, Air Jordans in really good condition. You hunt for stuff that packs a big wallop when it does sell, stuff that you can make 1,000% ROI on. And once you build up enough of that and you start getting regular sales, each sale conveys a huge amount of profit. So that is kind of superficially what my business model looks and feels like. It's maintaining a small inventory, and it's very, very knowledge intensive. The biggest advantage of the high ASP model is that you don't really have to list that much. If you can find enough pieces that are worth $100, $200, $300, $500 in a day, you can come home and bang out those listings in an hour. If you find 5 pieces that are worth $100 each, your job is basically done. You just have to take pretty good photos and make a good listing and put it up and resign yourself to the fact that it's probably going to take a while to sell. But once those sales do start trickling in, you make enormous profits. It's very exciting. It's really gratifying. And it's not a cheap thrill either. I mean, it's really good money. There are people that make great livings doing this. So the big drawback to the high ASP model is how knowledge intensive it is. So you can carry yourself over the threshold with phone research. I mean, if you get good at looking stuff up on your phone, you don't have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of whatever niche it is that you're selling in. For clothing, it is pretty incumbent upon you, if you do really want to do serious damage with a high ASP business model, to learn the corpus of knowledge when it comes to whatever clothing it is that you want to sell. So a lot of people specialize in something, specialize in suits or specialize in pants, specialize in shoes, or they've just done it for a long enough period of time where you just know what you're looking at regardless of what the particular category is. You know so much about brands, so much about the pieces within those brands, that you have a breadth and depth of knowledge that can't really be replicated just by doing phone research. You can get close, but you can't quite get there. You can't quite cultivate those killer instincts of the true expert. If you can get to the point, or you're already there, where you have knowledge of clothing that borders on the supernatural, if you have mutant X-Men powers when it comes to identifying value and knowing what the market is doing, and having like deep brand knowledge, it could be a wonderful business model. I will say, having observed the people that I do observe on YouTube, that COVID has not been necessarily that kind to the high ASP sellers. The ceiling of what people are willing to spend on clothing has dropped over the course of the pandemic. It's always been the case that the majority of clothing on eBay sells for under $20. I think it's like 80% or something. But there was this top echelon of clothing that was still really appealing to people, and people would spend, $800 sometimes for a really rare shirt. And that's still there, but that's diminished. So just subjectively, as an outside observer, it seems like the high ASP clothing model is not as popular as it was pre-pandemic. Now I want to talk about the main alternative to both of these business models, and I'll get into the weeds in terms of the high sell-through selling and the pros and cons there. And I'll do it in conjunction with describing this alternative viewpoint, because they're pretty intimately related. And also, this was the content of the argument that I had. So I had someone come in to my comments and excoriate me for being a fool and a charlatan, because I was misleading my viewers, because the only acceptable vision of long-term sustainable clothing reselling is the high volume, low margin model. And this person was a zealot. This person promoted this idea with like not a shade of ambiguity or nuance at all. There was no room for interpretation. he was a true believer in this divine truth of the high volume, low margin sell through. I think that's a position of weakness. I think, I don't know, we'll not talk about him, the guy. We'll talk about his ideas, because there are a couple of important ones to take into consideration when you're thinking about how you want to sell clothing long term. So the high volume model goes like this. The majority of clothing that people buy is, like I said, under 20 bucks. So the best way to sell clothing is to focus way less on sourcing and way more on photographing and listing clothing. So in order to accomplish this, you have to reduce your criteria for your purchase when you're sourcing. So whereas I would walk in to a Goodwill and I would cherry pick probably between 10 to 30 clothing items from one thrift store based on sell-through metrics or my eye or experience. I'm very selective when I do source clothing for the reasons that I described. Someone who is doing a high volume model would have much lower standards and would just kind of pseudo indiscriminately accumulate clothing as long as it's a recognized brand, as long as the condition is right, and as long as it satisfies some basic level of aesthetic acceptability based on what fashion trends are doing. You take a big bite out of the clothing section, you buy it all, and then you spend the rest of your time photographing and listing. All of that stuff, or most of it, is not going to be highly in-demand clothing items. So in order to start realizing regular return on that investment, you have to wait. This is mostly longer tail, meaning clothing items that are going to take much longer to sell. But once you build up a head of steam, once you accumulate enough listings and you're doing basically nothing but listing, after a while, the rain begins to fall as a pitter patter and then it's a torrent. So you can get to a level, it's commonly reported that these guys make like $1,000 in gross sales per day. That's what this guy claimed. It's what Daily Refinement does, and that's certainly what he makes. It's also what Tech and Sports does, kind of. He's a famous, internet famous reseller for being a solo operator who I think he made like $1 million just doing used clothing without employees. These sellers, the high volume sellers, have really high volume, thousands and thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of listings just of used clothing, and most of it is crap. I mean, I don't say that pejoratively. I mean, like, it's low valued stuff. So it's stuff that's going to sell between 10 to 20 bucks for the most part. So you're realizing, maybe $5 to $10 profit per item, but you're working so much volume that you're flipping just a huge quantity of pieces every day. But it takes a long time to get to that point. In the interim, you're going to have to probably get storage space. You're going to have to get a storage unit or a warehouse or office space. You may have to hire an employee unless you are a demon when it comes to listing. And also, you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait to start realizing really big profits. In the meantime, you will have put in all of this investment up front and all of this work to get the stuff up and listed, and you're going to make paltry profits. And that in the long term isn't a problem, because in the long term, once you build up adequate inventory, it does start paying off in a big way. I mean, this is a proven business model. If you have the means and the motivation to do that, then you should do it. This is basically how big box stores operate. Someone like Walmart or Target, they don't make that much profit per item. They make pennies on the dollar in terms of, the majority of the stuff that they sell. They make just tiny, infinitesimally small profit, but they work insane amounts of volume. The high volume selling absolutely works. I mean, it's a great goal to have if you're looking to the long term. If you're not allergic to sitting in front of a computer working for hours and hours and hours a day, if listing doesn't really bother you after a while, then it's probably a great thing to consider. It does come freighted with its own problems. I mean, it's definitely delayed gratification, where you have to be willing to sit on a piece of clothing for a year, maybe 2 years at some point to realize paltry returns. $5 profit on some, piece of crap shirt that you bought that someone ostensibly will want at some point. But if you are willing to stomach that risk and you are willing to deal with all of the logistical headaches that come with working an inventory that huge, of coming up with really streamlined organizational systems, which, is not a bad idea anyway, but becomes imperative at that scale. Hiring and managing employees, renting a warehouse or office space or a storage unit, and outlaying also a lot more for shipping supplies and spending more time on shipping, which is, not necessarily a huge deal, but the scope of your business just expands enormously when you get to that level, as maybe it should. So that's one thing to have in the back of your mind as an alternative to doing something like a treasure hunting model of clothing reselling, which gets impugned a lot as a newbie way to resell or an inferior way to resell. Interestingly, none other than Tech and Sports actually advocates looking up sell-through rate, or at least it seems that he does based on interviews that I've listened to. So these big players, these big resellers who have this enormous inventory still advocate being conscientious about what it is that you buy unless you're working an enormous amount of inventory. And I think that that's true. So one of the vulnerabilities of doing either a high ASP model or something like what I'm doing is that it is more vulnerable both to, circumstances, temporary circumstances like injury, or if you get sick, or if something like COVID happens, where I do have some padding. There is some synovial fluid still in the joint. It's not just bone on bone. But my business did take a big hit that I'm still recovering from with COVID, especially because I'm not thrifting. I mean, my business is still operating, but it's operating at a greatly reduced capacity simply because I can't do my normal volume with sourcing. And I have to kind of hunt and gather for stuff in a way that I didn't before. So that's absolutely true. If you have 15,000 items in your store, you're not going to have this problem, or it's not going to hurt you as badly. The big upshot is that I have freedom now. And anybody who wants to say that you are obligated to work 12 hours a day for 3 years with no days off in order to be a successful reseller can go f themselves. No business model is perfect, and it's kind of a truism, but the truism is true that not every business model makes sense for every person. Based on whatever it is you want to do with reselling, there is a way to do it, and there's no one correct way. I mean, there really truly isn't. In the long term, there are a lot of reasons to really seriously consider doing a high volume model. There are very serious reasons to consider hiring people, expanding your business, scaling up to as high as you can possibly go, because it does give you more income, gives you more stable income, more reliable income, and in the long term, it does afford you more freedom to where you can step away from the business and not have it falter and sputter. And if something bad happens, you're more insulated against the whims of the market than a smaller scale seller like me. You're still not invincible. I mean, the market is the market. We live in an economy that is insane, and all of us could be walking around wearing burlap sacks in 10 years. I mean, we could be eating dogs on the street in 10 years. That is possible. So if you want to pat yourself on the back for being the real businessman and having the one truth to unlock a future of eternal comfort and gratification, then maybe you're delusional. There are alternative visions of what it is you can want out of reselling. So if you're a part-time seller, if you're just trying to make a car payment, or you just need an extra $500, whatever. Maybe you have a kid and you have to buy them medication. You don't have to have 10,000 shirts in a warehouse with 3 employees to make that happen. Even if you want to just have a modest and relatively sustainable income without having to hire an employee or have a ton of clothing or whatever it is that you sell, you can do it. This other cliche of work smarter, not harder, you can do either, you can do both. someone like Tech and Sports, I think, does both. I do not believe that at the highest echelons of clothing selling, people are truly, completely, indiscriminately buying clothing, regardless of brand or sell-through. That seems idiotic to me. It doesn't match up with my own experience, my own observation, or the things that these guys say when they do speak. These are questions that are good to be challenged on, either to develop answers for in the first place, or to remind yourself of what your answers are, and make sure that they're good, sound, rational answers based on your actual needs. So if you're just aping someone that you see on YouTube and their business model, and you don't know exactly why you're doing what you're doing, then that should give you pause, and you should think more deeply about what your goals are with reselling, and what you want your day to look like, what you want your quality of life to look like in the short, medium, and long term, and what you think is the best overall choice to meet those needs. So obviously, I prefer this model of reselling for a number of reasons that I haven't even discussed. A big one, and not to get too personal, but I struggle really badly with chronic pain. I don't have it as badly as a lot of people, and I don't talk about it on the channel that much just because I don't want to sound like I'm whining, but the listing process is really quite painful for me if I don't take adequate breaks, if I'm not very, very conscientious about how I do it. I can stay up until 5, 6 a.m. because I'm in so much pain I can't fall asleep. So it doesn't make sense for me to list 70, 100, 150 items a day. I'm simply not going to do it. Maybe in the future that won't be the case, but this is an illustration of the fact that everybody has different circumstances, everybody has different limitations, everybody has different needs and wants based on their circumstances. And just to say that there's one cookie cutter true path to walk is insane, and you shouldn't think that way. You also just shouldn't passively accept stuff that you see from people without thinking it over yourself and making sure that it actually does make sense, it actually does get results, and it's going to get you the result that you want. The high sell-through model might not make the most sense for you. You might want to focus more on quantity over quality because there are a lot of good reasons to do that. You might want to focus only on quality. You might want to do the high ASP model. There are lots of benefits to doing that as well, and there are other role models to learn from. For my circumstances, my money, and my temperament, this makes the most sense. So I would like to hear your thoughts about it. If you want to leave me a comment, I'm not trying to game the engagement metrics. I'm open, as we all should be, to I guess criticism or thoughts, or if I said something that resonates with you. If you're an experienced person, I'd like to hear your thoughts. So I appreciate you watching, and I hope that I made at least a little bit of money. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's @thriftalife. I don't think I've plugged that on here yet. So thanks for watching.